Welcome to Old Path and our study through the book of 2 Kings. We make it to chapter 11, and I guess the way you could put this is we're just looking at what is a real sad part of the history of Israel. We know it as the kings, and just for sake of kind of the ease of use, as we start out this session today, I'm going to put back up a graphic that we have of the kings, because again, I understand it can get almost overwhelming when you hear these names if it's not really clear. I try to make sure that I'm making mention of it when we transition from the kings of Israel to the kings of Judah, and we go through that, because there's quite a back and forth to it. I know a lot of times their names sound very familiar, and sometimes it's the exact same name that's used. So we're getting a chance to see one of the really sad years or stretch of years in Judah, and some things that had taken place. This is also really these two chapters kind of chronicle what is a case study in doing the right thing but not completely. We've run into this before, where a king would come in and would implement a number of changes but not go all the way with it. And so I think what we can probably understand about this, if we even try to put it towards modern day and the church and our own lives, if we wanted to even say that, pretty much every major failure, just about every major failure, you can look at it and say it began with compromise. And so we know that kings would come in and they'd be honorable before the Lord down in Judah, at least, never in Israel, never in the northern tribes. But in the southern, you would have those times when you'd have a good king and then you'd have a really bad king. And even the good kings, as you look through it, and as you chronicle in their lives, as we'll look at one today, you will find that even the kings that we would classify as good left all kinds of room for compromise, and that compromise really ended up never kind of getting rid of the problem that was happening in the nation at the time. So we'll point that out when we get there, but instructive for us, if I don't make any mention of it as we get to it, it is instructive to us to recognize that compromise may not seem like a big deal at the time, but we know that the enemy loves to exploit the smallest of weaknesses. And I would say that when it comes to compromising what we may believe about the word or our own conduct, when we know that God has set a standard, and here, let's just be honest, God will set us a standard, and it's impossible for man to ever really keep what God puts forward as perfection or as a standard. But when he sets one forward, and we know what we're supposed to do, and yet we find some way to kind of work around the edges of it, or find a way to kind of get around it, compromise, the consequences of that is just devastating. And I think all of us probably can look at times in our own lives where we realize that's the case. So it's just really instructive when you look through this. And this is, again, why I think it's great for us to have a good understanding of the history of Israel, not only for just the historical aspect of it, the application aspect of it is hugely important, like what we'll look at today. But it also helps us to understand about how God does what he does. So it helps us in the theological sense, and it really does inform a lot of why we do the things that we do and those kind of things. So it's just really good for us to take all of that in and to really understand that the Old Testament is put there for us to understand not only the history, again, the application, but then also why God does what he does, how he does what he does, and it gives us an informed understanding of the New Testament as we take all of those things into account when we study through the New Testament. So chapter 11 is where we are today. Again, really, I guess you would just say a sad part of their history. And pardon me if I'm clearing my throat a lot. We're trying to figure it out. I've lived here in Texas for about a year and a half. Growing up as a kid, this has nothing to do with the study, but growing up as a kid, I had a lot of problems with allergies, and apparently this is like the allergy mecca of the country. But this was not really the reaction that I would get to it, but clearing my throat all the time is happening just over the last couple of months, and the pollen season's high. So there you have it, little added bonus about me that you probably didn't even want to know. But if you're thinking maybe I'm sick, I'm just fine. I'm clearing my throat. All right, so are we done with that? Chapter 11 is where we pick up today, and let's have a word of prayer. We'll take a look at it because the little background's already been done. Father, we thank you as we come to your word, and we pray that you would give us understanding ears and hearts, that we would, as we study through this, understand the reasons for it. Why is this important? Why should we understand? And why should we learn? And why should we take the time to study through these matters? This is the history of Israel, and it's a history of the kings. So, Lord, we pray that we wouldn't be that flippant about how we look at it, knowing that there is so much that the church could learn from this. Compromise right at the top of that, but then how you are so enduringly patient, even with people in rebellion, knowing that you have further plans that are even to our day future. So we give you thanks. We give you all praise. We thank you for your patience with us. We thank you for your love and the dedication that you have given to us by sending your Son and reconciling us through his blood. We give you all thanks and praise and ask that you would be glorified in Jesus' name. Okay, so before I read the first couple of verses, let me just make sure that I throw this out there again. The kings were not what God wanted for the nation. So the condition of things in Israel and the idea that they had kings was always going to be a problem like this. Think about it when it was really kind of the best idealistic way that God could have governed his people. Moses and then after him Joshua, men who were dedicated to him, not perfect. They had their failures, but still there was one person that God could have gone to. He went to Moses. Moses was reluctant in the beginning, but then really took on what God had asked him to do, and for the most part was really good at what he did. The few failures that he had were catastrophic, there's no question. Joshua, who had been there with him for all of that time, was once again a person that the whole nation could look to as a leader, and he brought them into the land of promise, made all the way back to Abraham some roughly 500 years before. They finally came into the land and began to subdue it. But at the death of Joshua, we know that we went through that time of the judges for several hundred years. Now here we are to the kings. And we're about 150 years roughly after the time of Solomon, just in round figures. So with all of that said, we get to chapter 11, verse 1, and it says, "When Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she arose and she destroyed all of the royal heirs." Now, what we don't think oftentimes is that there could be a possibility that between the male, lines, or sometimes it wasn't just a direct succession from the family line of Jeroboam or the family line of Rehoboam, though that did hold into Judah. We know that in the north there were people that wiped out and then took by force what was the kingship in the north. So under normal circumstances, the kingly line would follow the family line. In this case, this woman here, it's the mother, if you notice, she kills all of her grandchildren. And so that way, no one is there as the successor, and she could reign as queen and not as king. That's what's taking place here. So just once again, this is supposed to be the, quote, children of Israel. And here you have in the north, from the line coming down from Jeroboam, though no longer his family line, but through the line in succession from, regime to regime. This is over the tribes of Israel, the children of Jacob. And here you have this kind of just incredible wickedness, all for power. Now I think we understand why God did not want anything to do with kings. If you remember from 1 Samuel 8, when it was first discussed, God did try to warn the people, told them that this is not what God wanted, and they are really going to kind of rue the day that this would take place. And so here it is down the line, and we see that incredible wickedness for power, this just evil, godless woman doing this all for the sake of power. So make sure that we understand that. That's really the motivation behind all of it. So, sorry, I had a visitor at the door that I had to take care of. My apologies. All right. Let's just go to verse 2. Let me read it one more time. Verse 2. So Jehosheba, the daughter of King Joram, sister of Ahaziah, took Joash, the son of Ahaziah, and stole him away from among the king's sons who were being murdered. And they hid him and his nurse in the bedroom from Athaliah, so that he was not killed. And so he was hidden with her in the house of the Lord for 6 years, while Athaliah reigned over the land. So the house of the Lord, we were talking about the temple. So Solomon's temple, for 6 years, the last surviving of the heirs that could have been, that could have taken over. How she didn't recognize that he was missing when she was wiping out the rest of them is really kind of an interesting thing. When we read in 2 Chronicles 22, I believe it is, we find out that this person, again, we look at, let me just make sure, I'll point all this out, and you'll see the list of the kings. This Jehosheba, the daughter of Joram, the sister of Ahaziah. So Ahaziah has been put to death. It's Ahaziah's mother who starts wiping out all of her grandchildren. It is the sister of Ahaziah who says there's one that is still remaining of his heirs, and she takes him, and it turns out that she is married to the high priest, Jehoiada, that we'll see here in just a moment. So with that being said, she sees her opportunity, and for, imagine that, 6 years, you have to raise this child. He doesn't get to go out, apparently, from everything that we see. He's hidden away until, why 6 years? You can debate the whole thing, but he was only a year old when this happened, because he becomes king at 7 years old, as we'll see here in just a moment. So this is an infant when he's first taken away, and they raise him in Solomon's temple. Interesting. So, verse 4, so in the 7th year, Jehoiada, he's the high priest. So let's remember, the high priest overseeing the temple, in the residence parts of the temple, he has his wife, who is the sister of the king who was killed, Ahaziah, and she takes Joash, this little boy, and brings him to the temple. So the high priest sees the wicked grandmother, if you will. Gosh, it sounds like a Disney movie, doesn't it? Takes this, finally it's enough is enough. It's time for the rightful king, though he's only 7 years old, to be put in place. The woman who has done this is a usurper. She sits in that position as the queen, and she murdered her way to that place. Clearly the rest of the nation is in a place of absolute decay, and idolatry, as we're going to see, because of the actions that take place at the hands of the new king. And of course, because of Jehoiada, the high priest, he's going to want to make sure that they start to put things back the way that they should be. So we'll get to all of that. It'll be obvious as we go through it. So in the 7th year, Jehoiada sent, and he brought the captains of the hundreds and the bodyguards and the escorts, and he brought them into the house of the Lord to him. And he made a covenant with them, and he took an oath from them in the house of the Lord, and he showed them the king's son. So nobody knows about this, but now he's bringing in kind of the military commanders, the people that would be able to make sure that this transition takes place as it should. Again, the woman who is there is not only wicked and evil, she has murdered her way to the position, and now is the time that enough is enough. And whether they were just waiting for him to be old enough, 7 is hardly old enough to be a king, but it's different than being 1 year old. So you get the picture here. So anyway, whatever the delay, we're at his 7 years. Now Jehoiada brings them in. So it says 1/3, here's what he said to do. Then he commanded them, verse 5, this is what you will do. 1/3 of you who come on duty on the Sabbath shall be keeping watch over the king's house. 1/3 shall be at the gate of Sur, and 1/3 at the gate behind the escorts. You will keep the watch of the house, lest it be broken down. The 2 contingents of you who are off duty on the Sabbath will keep the watch of the house of the Lord for the king. So we're going to place you in different parts of the city. Now, the two groups that would ordinarily not be on guard are supposed to be there at the house of the Lord to watch over the child. Now, verse 8, but you shall surround the king on all sides, every man with a weapon in his hand, and whoever comes within range, let him be put to death. You are to be with the king as he goes out and as he comes in. So he understands entirely that the grandmother, who is now there, is very much going to rebel against this, and realizes that there may be people who will try before what would be seen as a coup. She's going to call it treachery or treason. There's going to be obviously a problem here as soon as they pronounce this 7-year-old as the king. She doesn't even know that he's alive, doesn't even know that he exists. She thought she's gotten rid of the entire line. So here, Jehoiada, the high priest, is putting everything in place, saying, when we pronounce this, there is going to need to be people who are in place that can keep any kind of potential murder of the new king, keep that from happening, but to keep order in the rest of it, and they're going to have to deal with the grandmother. So all of that's being put in place. So verse 9, so the captains of the hundreds did according to all that Jehoiada the priest had commanded. Each one of them took his men who were to be on duty on the Sabbath, with those who were going off duty on the Sabbath, and he came to Jehoiada the priest. And the priest gave the captains of the hundreds the spears and the shields that belonged to King David that were in the temple of the Lord. So really kind of a reminder of just where they had come from, if nothing else. It's interesting that those things still remain. The escorts stood, every man with his weapon in his hand, all around the king, on the right side of the temple and on the left side of the temple, by the altar and the house. And he brought out the king's son, put the crown on him, gave him the testimony they made, and they made him the king and anointed him, and they clapped with their hands, saying, long live the king. So here we know this is going to create quite the ruckus. Somebody that nobody knew was alive, but for the small few that were able to keep it, well, you can call it a conspiracy. The idea that she had killed off all the other ones like him, the idea that people kept him alive would have been a small group, I'm sure, because you don't want word leaking out, which is pretty impressive that you could keep that under wraps for 6 years. Pretty impressive. So anyway, they anoint him king. So clearly all of the uproar that would take place would be pretty formidable. Now, if you've ever been in Israel, there is the bustling city that's there, and you have a lot of city traffic noise, cars, and all the things that come along with technology and all the rest of it. If you've ever been there, like I say, the areas that we're talking about are pretty small, and you can really hear a lot of commotion. You can hear noise when it's going on. I remember being about halfway down the Mount of Olives on what is known as the Triumphal Entry Road, and we were just talking, and we could hear all kinds of commotion going on, screaming and yelling and hollering at the Temple Mount up by the Dome of the Rock, that big golden rock, big golden dome rather. So anyway, you could hear that from across the valley. And that's with all the city noise and with all the people talking and everything else. You could hear the ruckus. It just kind of reverberates around in the canyons that are there. So with this being something that would have been quite noisy, it's going to arouse the attention of Athaliah, the grandmother. So this is all what takes place. Now, when Athaliah heard the noise of the escorts and the people, she came to the people in the temple of the Lord, and when she looked, there was the king standing by a pillar according to the custom, and the leaders and the trumpeters were by the king, and all of the people of the land were rejoicing and blowing trumpets. So Athaliah tore her clothes, cried out, treason, treason. So the idea that she would have a problem with, quote, treason when she murdered her grandchildren to get her position is irony of ironies. But again, so thoroughly, infested with wickedness was this woman that she didn't even understand irony, nor did she understand the incredible cruelty and how drunk you can be with power that you would do stuff like that. It's just disgusting when you stop to think about it. So here she says treason, and kind of an interesting thing. So Jehoiada the priest commanded the captains of the hundreds, the officers of the army, and he said to them, "Take her outside under guard, and slay with the sword whoever follows her." For the priests had said, "Do not let her be killed in the house of the Lord." And so they seized her. They went by the way of the horses' entrance into the king's house, and there she was killed. So take her outside of the holy place and put her to death there. So they did exactly that, got rid of her. So here you have this brand new installed, if you will, 7-year-old king. And so then it goes on. Now, in verse 17, so then Jehoiada made a covenant between the Lord, the king, and the people, that they should be the Lord's people, and also between the king and the people. So great, wonderful. This would be what you would hope to have happen. It's sad that it had to be done after the fact. This should have been right out of the box. This is how that should have been. But again, we realize that the incredible wickedness that was infesting the country at the time. So the fact that this was going on is really no big surprise. So what you have is Jehoiada, and a good thing that he wants to do. Let's do this between the people and the king and the priesthood. Let's put things back in the order that they should be. Let's make a covenant which really makes people engage in the whole process. We have to do this. It's an agreement that would be binding to the people. So this is what he asks them to do. All the people of the land, they went to the temple of Baal. They tore it down. They thoroughly broke in pieces its altars and its images. They killed Mattan, the priest of Baal, before the altars, and the priest appointed officers over the house of the Lord. So they're eradicating the formal places of worship for the pagan deities that really were infesting the entire. You keep hearing these terms, the prophets of Baal. This is the same stuff all the way back to Jezebel. It had clearly been in place for a very, very long time, exactly like God said would happen. If you allow these people in the land to coexist with them, they will corrupt you. Here's evidence that goes on and on and on, hundreds of years. Exactly what God said would happen happened, because people were not obedient to what he said to do. So they took the captains of the hundreds, the bodyguards, verse 19, the escorts, and all the people of the land. They brought the king down from the house of the Lord, and they went by the way of the gate of the escorts to the king's house. Then he sat on the throne of the kings, and so all the people of the land rejoiced, and the city was quiet, for they had slain Athaliah with the sword in the king's house. Jehoash, same thing. He was 7 years old when he became king. Okay, great. So what we have, you'll see what he wants to continue to do. Really, it's a very cool thing that he's attempting, and it's what you would want to see take place. And we're going to see how it transitions into chapter 12. His heart stays in that kind of a place. Now, at 7 years old, I don't expect that he really fully grasps what all of this is, but nonetheless, you can see that it kind of carried in through the rest of his life. Although you're going to find that there are things that he did not do. It didn't complete the task. So what should have taken place, if you want to know what this would look like perfectly, it would be a king takes over, and especially as he grows, it's not just a one event. It's not tear down that temple, get rid of the priest, and be done with it, and then forget about it. What should have taken place, if this was ever going to be genuine revival, is to say, not just there close to Jerusalem, but anywhere that you might have it within your kingdom, find all of it. Even the places where people might go into what we're going to see here as the high places, the places where they would go up into kind of more secluded areas to offer offerings rather than just a temple. So a king, if he really had it together and he was old enough to really understand what he should be doing, tear down the biggest of the temples, but change the way that people are able to do what they do, even tearing down the high places, making sure that people can't go there and rebuild them. If people are going to continue in their idolatry, purge them. Now, people would hear me say that and go, well, so is that what the church should be doing? No, this is the children of Israel. This is the land of Israel. This is the king over the tribes. These are the people under the law. The United States is not under the law. The church is not asked to do what the kings were asked to do in these days. The children of Israel were under the law, and that's what the law prescribed for them to do. The United States is not under God's law, and it is not a God-governed nation, never has been. So God did not make a covenant with the United States, or any other country for that matter. Was it governed, our country? Was it governed at one point by people who were much more careful about being pleasing to the Lord and even knowing who He was? Absolutely, there's no question. The founders, some of those people were what we would consider as very dedicated believers. Others had some really weird beliefs and weird theologies and all the rest of it. There's no question about that. But if anybody wanted to try to make the case that the government in the late 1700s, the late 18th century, were any how do I want to say it? The idea that they were about the same as we are currently in the 21st century is just ridiculous. The country has become incredibly secularized compared to our founding, much more wicked, much more willing to accept the evil that we see in our society, and the church is in a place of just real decline in our world today, and in this country in particular. So to try to say that nothing has really changed since the founding of the country is absolutely ridiculous. The people that you might find in our Congress today and the presidents, if you wanted to try to do a side-by-side comparison to what they would have been like in those days, take a look at their writings. We have nothing like them today, but for a select few in Congress that are just a different, they stand far outside the mainstream of politics. But I don't want to get too caught up in this. However, it does help us to understand what happens when you have corrupt leadership leading your nation. We see it here. When corruption is brought in, it has a horrible effect on the people. This is a great indication of it. Chapter 12. So in the 7th year of Jehu, Joash became king. Now Jehu's up in the north. Joash became king, and he reigned for 40 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Zebiah of Beersheba. So that was Ahaziah's wives, one of Ahaziah's wives, and this is where Joash comes from. Joash did what was right in the sight of the Lord all the days which Jehoiada the priest instructed him. That's important. So remembering that from the time that he's 7, again, nobody understands the kingly duties, but Jehoiada, if you think about it, it would be something. Would he have a lot of input as far as the political side of things, or even the military side of things? This is really kind of pointing more at the spiritual side of things. The high priest would advise him on how to be a godly king. But notice this is very important in verse 3. But the high places were not taken away. The people still sacrificed, and they burned incense on the high places. So what are the high places? The high places would be traditionally, and you'll find time that there were high places where you would have actual it would be an actual place of sacrifice in a godly sense. You find some of those examples in Samuel, in the books of Samuel. It's not really where they were located, but what happened on those places. And they're made mention here that he did all the right things, except people were still able to worship the pagan deities by burning incense to them in the high places. If this were something that was being done in the godly sense, there would be no problem with it. And also, since there is a temple in Jerusalem, there's no need for it either. So throughout the territory, it was small at the time. Think about it. In the northern or southern tribes, you're talking about Benjamin and Judah and whoever had gone to the southern parts, even if they were from a different tribe, and left their place of settlement where their tribe would have been located. But it's a small area that Judah would have had. People could have gone to the temple as far as that was concerned. But be that as it may, the Levites would be all throughout the towns and the cities throughout the territory, as we're about to see here. So anyway, the idea of leaving high places able and open for people to do the things that they did was a problem with compromise, as I had said at the outset of this. Compromise is the issue. So look at what verse 4 says. So Joash said to the priests, all the money that of the dedicated gifts that are brought into the house of the Lord, each man's census money, each man's assessment money, and all the money that man purposes in his heart to bring into the house of the Lord, let the priests take it themselves, each from his constituency, and let them repair damages to the temple wherever any dilapidation is found. So there were a lot of things that would be brought in by the people. There would be money that was given for matters of atonement, things that would be offered in a free will offering. There are a few of them that are mentioned here, and it really doesn't, the detail of it isn't what's important. The idea that money came in, and what Joash wants to do, let's not worry about anything else, let's repair the temple. So that's our problem. The temple is the issue, and the fact that they would call it dilapidation, think about it again. Solomon's temple was fortified, if as we would think about it. As far as a building is concerned, you would have to try to damage it. Go back and look at the building of it. It was amazing. But only 150 years later, because of all of the corruption, it is already the place of needing repair. So Joash says, let's take all the money that comes in and not use it for any other reason other than let's repair the temple. Here's what's really weird about this. Look at what happens. So now it was so by the 23rd year. He's been the king for 23 years. He's gone from 7 years old. He's now 30 years old. When he actually asked to have this done, it doesn't tell us exactly when that was. As a 7-year-old, he wouldn't have probably given that order. But maybe it was done anyway because Jehoiada told him to do it. I don't know. But whatever it is, it's been a very long time, and at least something should have been being done. So it was in the 23rd year of King Joash that the priests had not repaired the damages to the temple. So King Joash called Jehoiada, the priest, he's the high priest, and the other priests, the ones serving under him, and he said to them, "Why have you not repaired the damages to the temple? Now therefore, do not take any more money from your constituency." Now, let me deal with the idea of constituency. The priests, though they would be at the temple, were also supposed to be ministering in the various towns and villages and places, cities within the territory. So there would be people that they would know that they would collect from the people that are there as they would minister to them. But it would also be the ones that were known to them personally, and this would probably be more for the free will offerings that were there. So the idea was, go to the people where you are and the people that you know in the areas where you serve and bring back from them of their free will. There was probably even the way of saying, we've got to repair the temple, it's been damaged, and devout people or people for whatever reason that would want to have the recognition would give additionally over and above what was mandatory according to the law. So here's what he ends up doing. So he called, King Joash called Jehoiada the priest and the other priests. He said, "Why have you not repaired the damage to the temple? Do not take any more money from your constituency, but deliver it for the repairing of the damages of the temple." Why did this not take place? And the priests agreed that they would neither receive any more money from the people nor repair the damages to the temple. So this is Joash's way of saying, let's stop what I've asked to do. There's no good explanation, and we don't get a reason why, but more than likely, it wasn't that there was a lack of money, because it wasn't to go to anything else. It's more than likely that they never put it to what they were doing. It was used for personal use. So he instead just says, I'm not going to do it this way any longer. So he comes up with a different plan. So Jehoiada, the priest, took a chest, bored a hole in its lid, and he set it beside the altar on the right side as one comes into the house of the Lord. And the priests who kept the door put there all the money brought into the house of the Lord. And so it was, whenever they saw that there was much money in the chest, that the king's scribe and the high priest came up, put it in bags, counted the money that was found in the house of the Lord. And they gave the money which had been apportioned into the hands of those who did the work, who had the oversight of the house of the Lord, and they paid it out to the carpenters and the builders who worked on the house of the Lord. So they bypassed the potential of the priests using it for their own purposes. So it's a voluntary thing. Put the money that comes in into this, and when we see that it's really accumulated, we're going to take it out and give it directly to the craftsmen and make sure that they take care of what's supposed to be. The money went directly to the people who labored. Now, you might think, well, how's that any better? Because that could be just as fraught with fraud. Look at what it comes up at the end of this. So, in verse 12, so to the masons and to the stone cutters for the buying of timber and hewn stone, to repair the damage of the house of the Lord, and for all that was paid out for the repair of the temple. Before we read any more at verse 13, stop for a moment and consider this. Go back and read it for yourself. What happened when Solomon's temple was dedicated? It would be to build it today, when you look at the raw material that's there, let alone even try to figure out what the labor would be. Just the material cost, I've seen it estimated upwards of $2 billion, and that was a long time ago because of the gold and everything else. Who knows how much this thing would have been? And when you stop to think about how big it was, we're not talking about a very large building. So it wasn't as though it was like some massive warehouse kind of a thing. It was the size of what we would consider as not a really big church. So I know our church back in California, the actual sanctuary itself was about the same measurements. I measured it out years ago, very close to the size of Solomon's temple. So our church on the inside of it, I think it was like 40 feet wide inside the sanctuary before you got to the stage, or where the stage ended, and then there was a behind the stage. And that was to, like where the foyer was about 70 feet. So add the whole thing in, it was about maybe 100 feet and probably about 40 to 50 feet wide, maybe 25 feet tall. And now you start to get an idea of about the size of Solomon's temple, just in round figures. So for it to be in the billions of dollars in modern terms, what it would cost to replicate it, the fact that it was this destroyed, where you have to have masons, stone cutters, and all the rest deal with it. It's not that just some scratched up furniture. It's not a little bit of damage to pillars and things like that. We're talking about something that has been wrecked 150 years after it had been built. Again, round figures, 150 years roughly. So it gives you an understanding when you see that kind of damage to it. It's not just the damage to the structure, but it speaks volumes of the damage to the people in the spiritual sense. Now, when God warned them about having a king, clearly he knew that this is what it was going to be. And consider this, the tribes of Judah were in much better spiritual shape than the tribes of Israel up in the north. That just gives you an idea how absolutely wretched things had become. So, verse 13, however, there were not made for the house of the Lord the basins of silver, trimmers, sprinkling bowls, trumpets, articles of gold, articles of silver from the money brought into the house of the Lord. But they gave that to the workmen, and they repaired the house of the Lord with it. So that tells you that there were other articles that were missing here, and they were not replaced at that time. Moreover, they did not require any account from the men into whose hand they delivered the money to be paid to the workmen. Stop there for just a moment, because we would think, well, how is this then any better than giving it to the priests, because there's no accountability? Look at what it says. For they dealt faithfully. That is a way of also saying the priests didn't. And so there wasn't crazy amounts of accountability, because what was given to them was reproduced in what was done in their workmanship. So it was an amount that was given to them was being shown to have been done in the place. So if they gave them a certain amount of money, they were getting a certain amount of work done, and obviously the finished work was correct based on what was given to them, unlike with the priesthood. So they didn't have to go with the accountability. Their workmanship and their faithfulness was evident by the produced work. So we see in verse 16, the money from the trespass offerings and the money from the sin offerings was not brought into the house of the Lord. It belonged to the priests. So there was still a way for the priests to be taken care of, as it should be. And if proper order was being sought after and seen to at the hands of Jehoiada, then they need to be able to support the priests. That's what God put in place according to the law, because they were not given land, they were not given anything. Theirs was the sons of Levi were to be the priesthood, they were to minister to the Lord, and that was their portion. They didn't get land, they got that. So, verse 17. Here is, again, one of the places that you find that Joash failed. Now, it's not stated, it is implied, it should be obvious to us. Before I read this, imagine, if you would, a king, and we're going to find that Hezekiah has a very, very different reaction when he is faced with something just as dire. And we'll get to him soon enough. But as far as Joash is concerned, he's implemented reforms like haven't been seen in a while. And a lot of good things were taking place. Repairing the temple was honoring. This was the place corporately where the nation would come together and worship God. It's a good thing. It's how it should be. But at the same time, he is threatened by the king of Syria, who has wreaked havoc up in the north and has gone over to Gath. So, headed towards towards the west of Jerusalem, and that's where he's doing the things that he's doing. And now he's turned his attention. He's coming to Jerusalem. Joash hears about it. Now, a godly king, I believe, would have said immediately, okay, we're being threatened by the king of Syria, but if he's really dialed in with the Lord, he goes directly to the Lord, maybe even to Jehoiada. Maybe Jehoiada didn't say anything to him. Maybe Jehoiada's got a problem with this as well, of faith, and believing that God should be able to easily repel Hazael, the king of Syria, because that's what's about to take place here. A godly king would be able to go before the Lord and say, God, would you fight our battles for us? This is a godless man, wicked, done horrible, horrible things, and now he wants to come here while we're trying to institute all of these things that would be pleasing to you. God, would you be our guard? There is, to me, no question, because too often we see in the history of Israel that when people turn their hearts towards the Lord, he would do miraculous things on their behalf. Instead, he sends a bribe. It's a sad anticlimactic part of his life as far as I'm concerned. Verse 17. Hazael, the king of Syria, went up and he fought against Gath. He took it. Then Hazael set his face to go up to Jerusalem. Joash, the king of Judah, took all of the sacred things that his fathers, Jehoshaphat and Joram and Ahaziah, king of Judah, had dedicated, and his own sacred things, and all the gold found in the treasuries of the house of the Lord and in the king's house, and he sent them to Hazael, the king of Syria, and he went away from Jerusalem. So, okay, some people would look at that and say, it's better that he gave them all that stuff, because from the way that they're sizing things up, if Hazael comes here, he's stronger than we are. So he's going to take all this stuff anyway. Why don't we just give it to him, and we will keep from the bloodshed and the people being killed and all that stuff. So it's a wager for them. It's like, what's the worst of our two options? The one thing that's never taken into account is for him to say what we would think, God, what we are doing I know is pleasing in your sight. We've torn down the sacred places of Baal. We've torn down his temple. We've done all this. We're repairing the temple. Now we're being threatened from the outside. God, would you please do this, and wait for God's answer. Now, again, as I've already said, there's no question that God would have done this. But they're making a simple, what they would think is common sense calculation. That's all that we can take from this. It never even gives God an opportunity to come to their defense and avoid them having to give their riches to a godless man, only empowering him further. It's a sad thing. Well, verse 19 says, now the rest of the acts of Joash, and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? And his servants arose, formed a conspiracy. They killed him in the house of the Millo, which goes down to Silla. Excuse me. For Josachar, the son of Shemeth, and Jehozabad, the son of Shemer, his servant struck him, and so he died, and he was buried with his fathers in the city of David. And then Amaziah, his son, reigned in his place. So we'll pick up at chapter 13 next week, and we'll look further into this. And again, just such a sad ebb and flow of the kings of Israel and Judah, in particular Judah, because you would have good kings and bad kings. But what a sordid history. It's just such a depressing thing to look at as far as the human interaction part of it. It is fascinating to show what people will do for power, but shouldn't come as any surprise to us. Also, people who are supposed to be known by his name can be some of the most wicked people among us. So just because of where you come from or what name you hold or whatever else doesn't mean that you have to be what you become, like with these people here. They had every opportunity to be right before the Lord. They were God's chosen people. This is the nation of Israel, people to whom the law was given, acting worse in some cases than even the pagans around them. So again, you can have all the right things in place and still do the wrong outcomes. That's just kind of a human nature, but it works in reverse as well. Doesn't matter where you come from. You can do what would be pleasing to God, and in this case, these people did things in reverse order more often than not. So instructive to us, very interesting, and it's intriguing when you stop to really study through these things. And I hope that these are helpful as you study through them and really kind of grasp onto what happens when man takes matters into his own hands, as opposed to when a person will humbly come before the Lord and say, I don't have the answers, and then they seek him for his counsel. That is where wisdom lies. So with all that said, we'll pick up next week. If you have any questions on this, contact us through the website, through the email, and we love to correspond with you. So until next week, we'll pick up at chapter 13. I pray that God blesses you, and I pray that you get time to read through these things after the fact and read forward and see what God reveals to you through his word by the work of his Holy Spirit. So until next week, I pray that God blesses you as you seek after him.